All right, so back to recording for Commander, something I haven't done in a long time. A big part of that was related to COVID, whereas for many people they were stuck at home or maybe without work because I work in a medical unit with the military. We were actually extraordinarily busy, and I wasn't always in town, so I don't remember if I mentioned this in the last video that I did, but that basically is the reason for the big gap in time. And I'm hoping now that I'm back and a little more settled in, we have a better rhythm for things that I should be able to produce more content once again. And hopefully y'all haven't totally lost interest. Anyway, I played a lot of Brea, but I was thinking as I was coming back to doing videos, I really wanted to try to find a new commander because I'd kind of worked Brea for a while, long enough that I wanted to make it more interesting by changing it up a bit. And when I was looking for options, I initially did a little playing around with Kenrith before the break, but it didn't quite feel like the deck felt good, but the commander really didn't feel like he was getting enough done for me. And I kind of shelved it and really hadn't done anything since then. Well, after coming back to it, I was playing against a fan of the channel, 5-Color Bad Stuff, and henceforth I should be calling him 5CBS. So he was playing Golos here, and he used basically the Brea sort of framework to inform his deck building decisions. And when I played against him with Brea, I was actually playing a 1v1 list, so he was playing it 1v1. And so it was a little bit different because you don't get to Mind Twist and you can't use Winter Orb and Strip Mine and a few other things. But it's still felt very powerful and very frustrating to play against as a control player because he had all the tools that I had potentially, plus additional threats from green. And on top of all that, he also had this commander that continuously was making it difficult to contain his mana base by allowing him to have access to more and more mana. It punished me for removing it. And if I didn't remove it, it punished me for leaving it in play, but because the ultimate on the commander is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, this card's a little bit like a planeswalker in the sense that it actually kind of has an ultimate. But in this case, you activate it for 7 mana. So if you're not familiar with how Golos works, it's when it enters the battlefield, you search for a land, put it into the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle, and then for 7 mana, one of each color plus 2, you exile the top 3 cards of your library, and you may play them without paying their mana costs. That means you exile them without shuffling your deck, which matters if you know what the top 3 cards are, and there's multiple ways you could do that, Sense's Divining Top being the easiest, most obvious one. Sylvan Library being the other one, but you could also say Brainstorm. Typically, it doesn't matter if you know what they are. Jace is another route. It typically doesn't matter if you know what they are. It's typically always good to use them, but you do get to play the cards, which means that if you hit land and you have not played land yet, you may play a land off of the top 3 that way. And so what ends up happening is because this deck's mana flush, you often, your worst hit, of course, tends to be a counterspell, but you often will, a little bit like Maelstrom Wanderer, you will hit more mana sources, and so it becomes easier and easier to use this thing, and it becomes even more impossible to contain the deck. So it snowballs out of control very quickly, and there are some amazing cards that you can hit that'll put you so far ahead that you win. Typically, if you start using them, you probably are so far ahead that you're already winning anyway. But it's a way to seal the deal, basically. The worst card that you can hit is Mind Twist, although because you can't play Mind Twist, it's an X spell, so you can't spend any mana on X when you use the Golos ability. You can sometimes play it and remand it back into your hand off the stack to get it into your hand if you want to retain it. Or you can just play it and throw it in your graveyard and Snapcaster or will it back later. Other than Mind Twist, though, pretty much every hit in here is valid. Even if you hit counterspells, you won't be able to, you can only play them until the end of the turn. But if you do hit counterspells, you can you can, let's say you hit a counterspell and a couple of other cards that you really like. Well, if you're playing against a blue deck, what that means is that you could then play the card that you really like. For example, maybe you play Teferi Time Raveler. The opponent has to counter that, or they're not going to be able to counter. But they're in a bind because you have a counterspell and in your top three, along with Teferi. Well, you go to play the Teferi, they counter it, and you counter for free off of the counterspell. So even if you hit a counterspell, it's actually not the worst thing. And it's until end of turn, so if you were to like play Golos, use his ability, hit a counterspell, and whatever else, you do everything, and you go to end your turn, and then, like, say one of the other cards you hit was like Chromatic Orrery, for example, and I'll talk about this card in a second, and then your opponent goes to like Disenchant it or whatever, and you can still play that free counterspell. They have to wait for their turn at least, and that can matter occasionally. Typically, of course, people aren't going to walk into that, but it's something to pay attention to. All right, so I said I was going to cover, I want to talk about deck construction a little bit. So a lot of it's the same framework as the Brea deck. A lot of it's going to be very familiar if you're familiar with the Brea deck, because sort of these are the cards that seem to work best together in a package, with the specific goal of like both trying to contain the threats that the format offers and present threats to your opponent to try to close out the game. So much of it's the same, still relying on the Winter Orb. Even though this is a 7 mana activation cost commander, we're still relying on Winter Orb as a way to control out of control mana production from the opponent, because it is the most efficient and compact way to do that. And you do have ways to cheat the orb in this deck as well. For example, we're still running Urza, which will tap the Winter Orb on your opponent's turn for blue mana, and then you get to untap all your stuff. You have Teferi to untap 2 lands per turn. You have Treachery, which, if you play it off artifact mana, will untap lands for you. So that's not too bad. A few other things, but anyway, the difference is that we actually are running a couple of additional talismans. So we're actually a little bit higher on mana than in an artifact mana than the Brea deck was. So this deck has Felwar Stone, because Felwar has the potential to produce, it produces 1 mana of any color your opponents can produce. And because this is a 5-color deck, unless they have all colorless lands or no lands or all fetches that they haven't cracked yet, unless one of those scenarios occurs, this basically is always going to tap for useful mana because you're a 5-color deck, right? So Felwar's in there alongside Arcane Signet. This is a staple. And then we also picked up the talisman of, I believe it's Curiosity, which is the green-blue one, which is 1 more talisman than the Brea deck had. So the talisman of Curiosity and the Felwar Stone, 2 additional mana sources that Brea was not using in the 2 slot. The other thing that the deck picked up was Renin 6 for a second Crucible of Worlds-like effect, and also to support the ability to shoot mana producing like Llanowar Elves and that type of stuff to support the Crucible lock. And that's important because this deck's much more capable of putting that together, because the commander fetches any land, so the commander can just go get Strip Mine and you can get started. You can get to work right away. So 2 best friends right here, Strip Mine and Golos. So because of that and the consistency that you're going to have with that, Renin 6 gets a lot better. Also, though, because quite often this deck wants to get, because this commander is a colorless casting cost commander, this deck really, really wants to get Mishra's Workshop. It's an incredibly insane card in this deck. To be comparable, Workshop, when you were playing Brea after sacking it twice, so that you were paying for the commander tax for 3 out of the 4 commander tax at that point, was totally nuts and super powerful. But before that, it was until you were paying the commander tax with it, it wasn't too helpful. Whereas for this commander, this would be like if Workshop tapped for red, blue, black or something in Brea, and paid 3 of the 4 cost. I mean, that's basically what this does for Golos. So the thing that's really crazy about it is not only does the Workshop play the Golos cheaply, but if you get the Golos, instead of getting Strip Mine, sometimes there's a situation where it's better off for you to go get Workshop with the Golos, so that, particularly if you're planning to chump block or whatever. So it can become really painful for your opponent. This is what I meant about containment. You can do things like play Golos, go get Workshop, chump block or whatever, it dies, replay it trivially, because you're up in extra mana. Use Golos, go get Ancient Tomb, replay it trivially after chump blocking, and like you're penalizing them for attacking in. You're actually generating mana. So this card it can cause Golos to act like a moat because they're fixing your mana base by attacking, which is just crazy. You can go get Cavern of Souls. You can just keep it running for a little while. One thing I want to caution you about, and this card may possibly not make the cut long term, although that seems a little crazy. I'm really on the fence about. I haven't decided yet. One thing I want to caution you about. So Mystic Sanctuary is in here because Mystic Sanctuary is nuts. It's an island that you can fetch, and if you control 3 or more other islands and it comes into play untapped, then you get to put an instant sorcery from your graveyard on top of your deck. This card's super, super good, and it makes blue fetches even more valuable than any other fetch because you can end of turn fetch Mystic Sanctuary and then untap, upkeep, draw the card that you put on top of your deck. And when that's like a mana drain or a demonic tutor or whatever, like it's super, super powerful. So an extra vindicate. But one thing to keep in mind with this is that Mystic Sanctuary does not say, so Mystic Sanctuary says it enters untapped unless you can, enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. It triggers not upon you controlling 3 or more other islands. It triggers upon entering untapped. So if Mystic Sanctuary enters tapped for any reason, it will not trigger even if you control 3 islands. And this is something I didn't understand, and I played Golos and attempted, and then got a Mystic Sanctuary thinking this is going to be great. Golos will just be like almost like a regrowth for the card that I want. So I play Golos, go get Mystic Sanctuary, it comes into play, and I have 3 islands, but what's going on? I don't get the card. Well, the reason is Golos puts the land that you search for into play tapped. So if you put the Sanctuary into play tapped for any reason at all, it doesn't trigger, even no matter how many islands you have. So something to keep in mind. So for that reason, Sanctuary is a lot weaker in here than it appears. But I use Mystic Sanctuary with other commanders that cannot fetch it. So I don't know if that's a reason not to play it, or if it's just a reason to just think about it when you're playing this deck, and maybe we just keep running it because it's a pretty boss card. It's a regrowth on a land. So what else? What else do I need to cover? Oh, I did want to talk about Chromatic Ori. So, and I also want to talk a little bit about what's not in here. So what we get from green right now, at least, is because we're playing Tithe, we're going to add Savannah into the deck as a searchable. And then we're playing Shackles, and we're also a blue base deck. So we're going to run the 2 duels. We're going to run Tropical Island and the Breeding Pool, right? So beyond that, we're not running Taiga. I'm not running green, black, Bayou, right? I'm not running Bayou and Taiga because red and black are splash colors already, and it would be nice because it would fix, like, my fetches would be able to always get the colors that I want, even when the fetch is like an awkward, like, for example, I'm not running Badlands either. So like, let's say I had so Badlands, Bayou, and Taiga are not in here, but so like, let's say you have a Verdant Catacombs, you cannot get red with this, even though in Brea you could, because you could get a Badlands. This deck doesn't run it, but the reason is because I needed extra like slots for forests, and the Savannah slot and the Tropical Island slot and the second Tropical Island, the Breeding Pool, are taken. I don't have room for a red-black dual land, basically. So just keep that in mind when you're fetching. The fetches are a little bit different. They're not guaranteed to always get you, so you have to kind of like fetch thinking about that as you're going, if it's going to matter. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that because this commander feeds off of colorless mana production is more valuable if it comes in larger quantities than colored mana production would be. So the Chromatic Lantern that was in here is actually gone and has been replaced by a Worn Power Stone, which seems weird because Chromatic Lantern in a 5-color deck seems like it makes a lot more sense. But you have to realize that this pays for almost half the cost of playing a Golos or one full commander tax. And once you play Golos, you can fetch, a 5-color land or whatever you need to fix your mana. So the Power Stone actually has more value than the Chromatic Lantern. Now the Chromatic Lantern does turn on Mishra's Workshop so that Mishra's Workshop will produce like blue, for example, which is nice. But you can also use Urborg. It doesn't make the workshop produce blue, but it does make the workshop tap for mana. So if that's a concern, you can still take advantage of that little interaction and still be pretty well off. In the meantime, the card that functions almost like a Chromatic Lantern is this guy that's been upgraded, this Chromatic Ori. And this thing's totally insane. This card probably doesn't belong in Brea because it's 7 mana is a lot to ask out of an artifact. And if you've already gotten to that point, you're doing pretty well in Brea. Basically, the Chromatic Ori is a card that you're going to want to play off Ancient Tomb and Workshop. And Brea certainly loves to get those cards, but doesn't get them, ultra consistently. Like you get them when you get them. You typically don't want to, like if you're going to Imperial Seal, you're not typically going for a Workshop unless you're already holding something like Thran Dynamo. You're typically going to go get, a Soul Ring or a Crypt. And this deck wants to do the same thing. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that after this deck tutors for a Crypt or a Soul Ring, it uses it to play its commander, who then goes and gets a Workshop, and suddenly the Ori only costs 4 mana, right? 4 mana and a Workshop, so 5 total. So all of a sudden, you're looking at this reducing the cost of this basically by 2 or 3. It's, depending on if you also have like a Ring or a Crypt or whatever. So suddenly this Chromatic Ori becomes ultra playable. Because if you have, say, Shop already, you go get Ancient Tomb, Golos, Ori, you're all set. And what Ori does is it lets you play, it taps for 5 colorless mana, which is insane, on a 7 mana investment. Because you can have 4 basic lands and 4 just non-special lands, right? And a Workshop as your 5th land, you can tap 4 lands for 4 and shop for 3 makes 7. Play the Ori and get 5 mana back as a rebate. You've used 5 lands to get 5 mana. So basically the card costs nothing, right? It rebates itself immediately. It costs mana on the stack and then it returns that mana to you off the stack. And then it lets you spend mana as though it were mana of any color, which is totally nuts. So because now you can tap a Soul Ring and cast Mana Drain, right? Like off of this, which is just crazy good. And then on top of all that, for 5, you can tap it and draw a card for every color among permanents you control. Now, that's not necessarily or typically going to be savagely good or anything. Like you're thinking, wow, tap 5, tap this, draw 5 cards is going to be crazy. But in reality, if you had like Oko and Duretti and Teferi out, so you had all your colors covered, or let's say you had like Sylvan Library, Duretti, Teferi, right? You already won that game. You honestly, sure, go ahead and draw 5, but it's not going to matter all that much. Typically, you're going to have Ori out with just mostly artifact mana and not really much by way of colored permanents at all. Maybe 1 color, sometimes 0. So that ability, it can be it's something you can use if you have the opportunity to use it, but that's not really necessarily the greatest thing. The greatest thing is the tapping for 5 mana and spending mana of any color, because Golos has that incredibly good ultimate, and Ori just fuels that like nobody's business. You can tap an Ori and a Soul Ring and activate Golos immediately, even though you just tap for 7 colorless. And so you can get into the situation, and then if you hit more artifact mana, you hit Thran Dynamo or whatever, that makes colorless. You hit Thran Dynamo and a Mana Vault or something. You can tap that 6 colorless and activate Golos again with all of the colors, 6 or 7 mana. Throw 1 other mana in there, even though it's colorless, because of the Ori's ability to transmute mana into what you need. So super powerful in this deck specifically, because this deck is going to get Workshop and Tomb a lot. And also, that's the reason why I have the extra colorless for Worn Power Stone. It also is really good with Ori. This just taps for 2 mana of any color, essentially, once you have this guy out. So that this isn't necessarily like always going to hit, and it's not always a goal, but having access to it does some incredibly cool things for this deck. So what's not in here currently? So I guess the other cards that are in here, Sylvan Library, it's now a 40 life format in multiplayer. So this basically says draw 9 for 2 mana. Pretty good. Now Sylvan Library does not work if you have Necropotence in play. These are not a combo. But if you upgrade your Sylvan to a Necro, that's totally fine. You've already won the game because you've had Sylvan Library out, and now you're just winning it more. If you play a Necro and it gets countered and you follow up with a Sylvan, you're fine. I mean, yes, sure, you have to pay 8 life to draw 2 cards with Sylvan Library, whereas 8 life would draw 8 cards with Necro, which is quite a difference. But the reality is that you have a lot of life to play with, and Sylvan Library is so cheap and easy to get down, you can potentially first turn it, that you can just like Ancestral with it for some life early on, drop down to around 30 or a high 26 or 28, and then with the cards, the extra cards that you get, you're going to be able to transition to Necro if you choose to anyway. But the truth is, I played this deck, and because the Golos ability is so powerful, in I think 20 games that I played with it, or that we played with it, I'll tell you about that in a second. It almost never mattered. The Necro Sylvan, like neither of these cards mattered that much because this Commander and then the Ori also, and the rest of what's going on in the deck are so good that like these were almost an afterthought. I mean, these are just an amazing hit on the Golos. For example, if you use Golos and you land on Necro, it's just it's already basically if you're using Golos, you probably won, but if you hit Necro, you definitely won. I mean, Necro is just unbeatable. Anyway, but so Sylvan's in there. It gives you a 2 mana drop that's incredibly good against aggro. Against control, and it's still really good against aggro because it's 40 life and not 20, and because controlling the top of your library is pretty good when you have a commander who rewards you for knowing what the top 3 cards of your library is. But just remember, Sylvan triggers during your draw step. Necro takes your draw step away. So if you do put in the Necro, the Sylvan will stop working, but as long as you have enough life, if you're able to make the transition from Sylvan to Necro, you should do it. You're going to be fine. You've already won that game. And then last, Oko. I don't really need to talk about Oko because it's been done to death. As far as what I can point out, there is, I suppose, a world where you exchange control of your Golos for something they have. Unlikely to be something you'll ever do. I wouldn't expect you to ever do that. But in general, you can also, of course, I suppose, make your Golos a green elk for some strange reason if you had some world where you needed to do that. But for the most part, you're probably not going to be doing any of that. This is, because there's no Jitte in this version, this is the only life gain, I believe, in the entire deck. I think Oko is literally the only way, the food tokens are the only way that you can gain life in this deck. So you do actually have to marshal your life total a little bit more carefully than you do in Brea, where Brea would support you by providing you with additional life, and Jitte would give you extra life. You don't have that here, so that is something to keep in mind. It may be something that gets changed later. I am unsure. Perhaps we'll see. But the thing is, this deck does not run Skull Clamp because you don't have Brea Thopters to eat with it. No Jitte, no Stoneforge, no Sword of Feast and Famine. Once again, you just don't have the extra creatures laying around, and you're doing other things that are a little bit less damaging over time and a little bit more immediately impactful. So, instead of Jitte, you've got like Sylvan Library, which you'd rather have in Wrenn and 6 instead of Stoneforge, that kind of stuff. So instead of Sword of Feast and Famine, you have Oko. So you're doing some pretty powerful things, and yeah, it's okay. The other card that's not in here is Disenchant, and I miss it. And I feel like I want it, or maybe even Ancient Grudge. Another card that could be really good in the 2 slot would be Sylvan Scrying. a card that goes in fetches Workshop, because it gives you the first turn 2 cast Sylvan Scrying, get Workshop, turn 3 play your commander, go get Strip Mine or something. And that seems so good, and probably is, that I feel like not having in here is almost certainly like a mistake. However, I do not know what to swap, like what change. Maybe the Felwar Stone should be the Sylvan Scrying? It seems kind of awkward, though. I mean, Stone is just so good. I honestly don't know. It's one of those things where I feel like not having it is a mistake, but I don't know how to fit the card in here. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'd be interested in that, as well as whether or not we end up needing a disenchant. Brea has actually got both disenchant and Karn, the 4-drop, to shut down artifacts. And this deck does not have either one. So, however, instead of Karn, it's got, I mean, basically Oko, Karn. Oko's going to shut down artifacts over time, and it's probably going to be, they're probably comparable. I suppose I could run both, but. So we're missing a few things, but we picked up a few tools, and it's a fantastic deck. So what I want to do is talk about the deck in this video. This will just be sort of the why do we switch to Golos, the Golos primer type video, and then I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to start a new one, and then I'll do gameplay. So I have I think about 20 games lined up that I can run through with Golos for you, and you can take a look and you can see what you think. Part of the other, before I wrap this up, part of the other reason why some of the cards are not in here is because they printed this insane thing that has to go in every commander deck, in my opinion, if you can play it, this Fierce Guardianship, where it's a free negate if you have your commander. That thing's just ridiculously OP, and I actually don't like the design of the card, because at least with Force of Will, you have restrictions. You have to have a blue card in your hand. You have to pay a life, and you have to lose that blue card. Like this thing, you just play your commander, and then you tap out to play your commander, and your shields go up. You're even safer with your commander in play than you were if you didn't tap out to play it, and that just seems like poor design to me. But while it exists, it does need to be played in every blue deck. So that also took a slot away from this deck, or away from all of my commander decks, basically. And I'm not complaining, because it's another tool in the toolbox, but it is alongside Force of Negation, which is just another blue card that is a mandatory play. These two cards, Fierce Guardianship and Force of Negation, have permanently reduced the number of options that I have in any blue-based commander deck, because they're just too powerful not to use. And so that is also part of the reason why there's currently no disenchant in here, is that I had to sacrifice a few slots for free counter spells, which is pretty gross. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you enjoyed this introductory tutorial, or not tutorial, but introduction to Golos, and I'm looking forward to seeing what your comments are. And go ahead and I should if I do this right, I'll have a link to the gameplay video in the comments or in my description. And if I don't get around to it, just keep an eye on the channel, and that'll be up as well. And until then, thank you very much for watching, and glad to be back. I'll see you next time.